Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining me in this session. We're going to talk about monsters tonight, and we're going to talk about two monsters in particular, two stories about monsters. I'm seeing that my slides are a little bit cut off, so if that ends up happening for anything important, I'll see what we can do. The only unimportant thing that's cut off here is my name and my affiliation. So I'm Paul Wolpe. I'm the director of the Center for Ethics at Emory University. I'm also a professor of Jewish bioethics there. And as someone who's done a lot of work in genetics and in transgenic animals and in various other ways that we create new kinds of forms and creatures, I've thought a lot about what it means to say that something is a monster, a word that didn't have the pejorative meaning that it has now, and does not have that meaning in a lot of scientific contexts. We talk about creating a monster, meaning something that's just hybridized. The story of the Golem is a uniquely Jewish story, and the story of Frankenstein is a uniquely Christian story in its own way, I would argue. And it's very important to start with, to say something about Frankenstein before I say something about Golem. How many of you, total honesty required here, how many of you have, if you're over 30, read Shelley's Frankenstein in the last 15 or 20 years, not when you were a kid? And if you're under 30, have read it at all? Raise your hand. Okay, that's good. That's more than usual. Because most people take the story of Frankenstein from Frankenstein films. And there have been over 100 films made of the Frankenstein story, major films. And very, very few of the films are even remotely about what the book was about. It's a very different book than what most people think Frankenstein is about. For example, how much time in Shelley's Frankenstein does she spend describing or discussing how the monster was made? One sentence. While in the movies about Frankenstein, the whole movie can be about how he actually made the creature. Yeah.
If I recall correctly, it's not referred to as a monster. Isn't it a creature?
It's called a monster also, but a creature, right, it depends who's talking. Because the other thing about the story, it's never, by the way, the monster's name is not Frankenstein. It's creature or monster. And Frankenstein is the creator. So Shelley never called the creature Frankenstein. And it's not a nice story. It's a really dark story. And there are three main characters in that story. The story is a story within a story within a story. The book is written as a series of letters written by a captain of a ship in the Arctic to his sister. He started this because he picked up a bedraggled, half-dead man from a sled in the Arctic, and that is Frankenstein, who has gone up there to chase his monster and kill him. And Frankenstein starts weaving this story, which is then the second narrative in the book. And then, towards the end, the creature comes on board and tells his story. So it's a very Rashomon type of book, where you begin to get different parts of this story. And also, many people have done a lot of analysis of these three characters as sort of, the proletariat, elite, and bourgeoisie, or as the creator scientist, the created creature, and the general public being played by the captain. So it's a very, very interesting book. And here's what I think is one of the most important parts of the book that people forget, because it really was Shelley's ultimate point, though it's not going to figure in necessarily too much in what we talk about tonight, but it's going to be part of the whole background of everything we talk about tonight. Why, of course, the generating moment of the book is not the creation of the monster. The generating moment of the book is when Frankenstein abandons the monster, when he abandons his creature. Why does Frankenstein abandon his creature? Yeah?
Prejudiced against his looks.
Exactly right. He abandons the creature because the creature is ugly. Because he had this very narcissistic, very grandiose idea that he was going to create a human being, and he had an Adonis in his mind. And he creates this horrifically ugly, big, sinewed, transparent-skinned creature that he described. and the horror of what he created. No wonder at the fact that he just animated dead flesh. No, it wasn't beautiful, and he runs away. So it is an aesthetic judgment that is the central dynamic of the book of Frankenstein. Now let's talk about the golem for a minute. We'll talk a lot more about that, but I wanted to set the stage. So, where did I put my clicker? So, the idea of the golem in Jewish lore and history is the idea of an unensouled humanoid. In fact, the Talmud calls Adam a golem for the first 12 hours of his life, under the assumption that it was about 12 hours before God breathed a soul into Adam. And there are other examples. Jeremiah was supposed to have created a golem, according to one legend. The Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, also describes instructions on how to make a golem. Solomon ibn Gabriel was supposed to have made the first female golem. But the first great golem that was made in Talmudic history was made by Rava, who was Rabbi Abba ben Rav Hama, but it was in the 4th century CE that he was supposed to have made it. And what was the nature of that, and why can we make a golem? The fact that we can make a golem, see, it's going to be cut off, that's too bad. So I'll read it to you. The fact that we can make a golem is based on this Hebrew passage. Luckily, you can read the entire Hebrew Hebrew sentence. But you're in English, avotechem, your sins, the things that you do that are wrong, mavdilim, separate you between you and Hashem, and your sins have hid his face for you so that you will not hear. And what the rabbis took from this was, if it wasn't for our sins, if it wasn't for our iniquities, we would be like God. Because this sentence says, in their interpretations, that what separates you from God is your iniquities, and if you didn't have any, you would be divine. And from this, the rabbis took that the less sinful you are, the fewer iniquities you have, the holier you are, the more you are like God. And therefore, the really great rabbis, the ones with the fewest iniquities, the purest ones, can do godlike things, including animating inanimate objects, including creating a variety of different golem-like creatures. And throughout the Tanakh, there are stories of other creatures. They create goats, they create other animals, and then they create human beings. Interestingly, the stories of the golem in the Talmud are there for a different purpose than the one we'll talk about most here. And that is, there's this whole discussion in Christian theology about how many angels you can fit on the head of a pin. And that, of course, is not about angels and pins. It's about trying to conceptualize the idea of infinity and what infinity would mean and what disembodiment would mean. And so in religious history, you use metaphors and stories to try to understand concepts. And what the golem is used for is to understand the nature of being alive when you're talking about animals, and the nature of being a human being when you're talking about human golems. So the question is, if you create a golem goat, must it be slaughtered ritually to eat it? So to answer that question, you have to decide whether it's really a goat and what goatness means, right? And the rabbis spent a lot of time arguing it wasn't born from a goat, so is it really a goat? Maybe it just looks like a goat. And they're really trying to discuss the nature of what it means to be embodied and the nature of what it means to be something. And the golem is a kind of intellectual exercise that is used to do these kinds of things. So Rava said, if the righteous wished, they could create a world, for it is written, your iniquities are a barrier between you and your God. And Rava created a man, that's how it says it first in the story, and sent him to Rav Zerah. And the rabbi spoke to him, but he did not answer. Then Zerah said, you are from the pietists, return to your dust, and the golem collapsed into dust. That's the first story. So Rava created the first human golem, according to the Talmud, and the rabbis don't have any problem with this. And this, by the way, is used over and over again by rabbinic authorities today to explain why it is, or to be the example of explaining why it is, that Jews do not have a problem with a lot of biotechnologies. That is, the Golem example says, we don't mind using our latest and best technology, which back then was incredibly accomplished rabbi who can do this incredible biotechnological feat. That's fine as long as it's done the correct way and with purity. In fact, the rabbis praise the creation of the Golem for the right reasons. There are modern golems. This is an article that was printed in the New Republic right after the cloning of Dolly the sheep. And it was written by Leon Kass, whose name didn't make it. It's under here on the slide because it's cut off. And Leon Kass, as many of you probably know, was the head of George Bush's Presidential Commission on Bioethics. He's a Jewish scholar, wrote a book on Breshit, and writes on many other Jewish topics. And he wrote this article in the New Republic shortly after the cloning of Dolly, when people were talking about the possibility of cloning human beings. And he writes, they are human, they cannot be replicated, the moral repugnance of cloning. Now, in this idea of cloning is this idea of replication, of creating human beings. Cloning, by the way, is just another way to reproduce. It is not a creation of a golem. It's not a creation of Frankenstein, and yet this is the picture that accompanied that article in the New Republic in Leon Kass's article. It is a picture of Frankenstein with a set of kind of semi-deranged Dolly heads on his chest, clearly connecting the cloning of Dolly the sheep to the legend of Frankenstein. In addition, as someone who's worked in this field for 30 years, I am constantly reading articles where Franken becomes a prefix to mean messed up, and you shouldn't, and we've gone too far, and you shouldn't touch these things, and they're bad, right? So they talk about Frankenfoods and Frankencells, and I made you a list there of just some of the things. The first clone cat was called Frankenkitty, and Frankenmice, and Frankenrice, and Frankenfish, and everything else. So interestingly, this image of Frankenstein has become the way in which people talk about exceeding the limits of technology, which was, in fact, what Shelley had in mind. On the other hand, the golem has kind of another image. It's interesting. The golem can't be used to make that message easily, even though in the legend of the golem of Judah of Prague, which I'll tell you in a moment that most of you have probably heard about if you know anything about the golem, there is something there about exceeding limits of technology, but there's also a big difference. So what is the great story of the golem? It is about the Maharal, which was the nickname, like Rabba was, of Judah Loew of Prague. And he created a golem in order to protect the Jews of Prague from pogroms. And we can go into detail about the story. He went down to a bank of the river. He took mud. He ritually walked around it, said his incantations, and the creature was animated. There are a number of different ways to create a golem, that is, ways to inscribe the golem with letters that animate it. One is illustrated here. Oh no, that's actually not. It's on a different one I'll show you in a second. That just says golem, which, by the way, is never what anyone puts on the head of a golem. But one way is to take a text and put it in the golem's mouth. Another way is to inscribe the word emet on its forehead. I think I have a slide of that. Is that next? No, it's a couple down. I'll show you that in a second. And what happens is emet means truth, but if you rub off the aleph, you have met, which means death, right? So the way you decommission your golem is you just rub off that aleph and it collapses back into a heap of mud. For the ones that have the script in the mouth, you simply pull out the parchment and they become ungolemed. These days, there's an awful lot of pictures. Try sometime to Google image golem, and you won't believe what you get. You get all kinds of images, many of which have nothing to do with the Jewish golem. but many of which do. And there are all kinds of, this is the Maharal actually creating the golem on the banks of the river. There, sorry, my laser pointer is not working correctly, but there's the river at the top, and he carves him out of mud, and he begins the process of creating the golem. Some of the golems are like the Hulk with a golem head, like this guy unfortunately can't see his head, and this guy here. Some of them are sort of formless, trying to get the idea of sort of no body or soul. This one is a little bit kind of, you know, scary. He looks like Scrooge, and I don't know, you know, what's the name of that movie that was made from the graphic novel that came out recently? With what? The Watchmen, thank you. He looks like the big blue guy in The Watchmen, for those of you who saw that. Anyway, there are all different kinds of depictions of the golem in modern times. And the golem is a very evocative modern symbol that's used quite often. If you Google golem, you'll get over 4 million hits. If you Google golem images, the last time I did it, which was probably about a year ago, I got 780,000 hits. And we know that the golem, the legend of the golem, inspired Shelley's Frankenstein, which was itself inspired by Golem, but of a different message than Golem, because Shelley's Frankenstein was really the first romantic novel that envisioned the limits and dangers of science. So, let's move into the question of thinking about the golem. This is the 1915 movie Dear Golem, directed by Paul Wegener, and Paul Wegener played the golem. So that's him right there, and we're going to talk about him in a second. But I wanted to show you, this was the, this is a modern piece of art, and it says golem down here, but there you see Emmet written on the forehead, and the aleph being removed, could be removed, and you could kill the golem, and that piece of art is by a guy named Brad Buckheimer, just to give him credit. A wonderful book when we're done, if you want to read more about what we're going to talk about when we get into the meat of this in a second, is Byron Sherman's Golems Among Us, How a Jewish Legend Can Help Navigate the Biotech Century. Wonderful book, fun and interesting. Now, I want to say a couple of things before I go into the question of how we think about these two things side by side in parallel and what the difference is between them. The story of Frankenstein is a cautionary tale. And it is a tale not so much about scientific technology as about hubris and about human limits. Frankenstein himself is a very unadmirable guy. In the story, in the book, Frankenstein is vain, he's a coward. When there are times that he can intervene and stop terrible things from happening, not just with the creature, he runs away. And the creature then comes and pursues him because of his abandonment. And there's some fascinating moments in Frankenstein where the creature himself tries to understand his own nature and is incredibly self-reflective. One of the things that happens, the creature, you know, who's abandoned goes and hides out in this little hut that has next to a house that has a hole in it, and he spends the next who knows how long, because it's not designated, watching this family and learning about humanity and learning language, so that after whatever short time, after, you know, starting out as a grunting creature, by the time he's done a year later, whatever, he speaks beautiful Victorian English. I mean, the way he tells his story is, you know, Shelley's best writing. So it's really remarkable. But he spends a lot of time, first of all, wondering what he is, how he should think about himself, why he was abandoned, how he must not have much worth if he was abandoned by his creator, and carries this enormous anger at being abandoned, which he then takes out by going and killing everything that's sacred to Frankenstein, his fiancée, and everyone else that he cares about. Finally, Frankenstein is forced to go and fix this mistake that he made. What is the precipitating moment, does anybody remember, of why Frankenstein finally decides that he's had enough? The creature comes to him and asks him to do something. He'll create a mate, right? So the creature comes to him to create a mate. He said, I'll stop all this if you'll end my loneliness by bringing me a mate, by creating me a mate. And Frankenstein says, I'll do it. So the creature goes off to wait, and Frankenstein starts to do it, and then he thinks to himself, wait a second. If I create this mate, I will be creating a whole race of these things, which then may very well take over the world and kill off all the human beings, and this is what we'll be left with. I won't be party to that. Never occurred to him to make an infertile mate, but we won't go there. So he refuses to do it, and that's and that's when he decides he has to kill the creature. Okay, now, so we have the story of Frankenstein, this cautionary tale about a man of great hubris who goes too far and then has to go back and fix his mistake. And we have the story of the Golem, the story of incredibly pure people who are the highest models of what you should aspire to, people of great sanctity who create a golem. And when we start to think about what the difference is between these two models, we can begin to see very complementary and very interesting parallels to how we should think about modern technology. So the first, this of course, the pictures that I've chosen here are Lon Chaney on the left and Paul Wegner on the right. So we've got two of the great portrayers of, the great portrayer of Frankenstein and one of the very few real portrayers of the Golem. So let's start thinking about what the differences are between these. And as I go through these, feel free to chime in and raise your hand, and we can talk about them as we go. So, in Frankenstein, the creation of human life is improper. Frankenstein is condemned throughout history. He's clearly condemned by the book. There's no question he shouldn't have done it, in the book's view. And throughout history, again, Frankenstein has been used as a model of what you shouldn't do. He transgressed, and he's condemned for his transgression. The Golem, on the other hand, not only is rather not condemned, but what he has done is considered to be quite laudable. It's not prohibited, and the Talmud has no problem, in theory, there may be specific instances where it has problems because it's not done correctly, with the creation of animate forms. Frankenstein's motives are mixed. He does talk about the fact that if he creates this creature, if he, now that he's learned how to animate dead flesh, that he will be able to cure illness. He will be able perhaps to create perfectly healthy human beings from scratch. But mixed in with that, shortly after he talks about that, he then talks about how he will be praised for that and how he might become almost godlike. There is an actual kind of Tower of Babel perspective in this book, that is, he is trying to reach a divine status. And it's kind of ironic because his attempt to be divine is what topples him, while in the Golem story, divinity is the prerequisite. So in the Frankenstein story, divinity is the consequence of being great enough to create a creature, while in the Golem story, it is the prerequisite to being able to create a creature. Right? The creator of the Golem does it with humility and in the service of the protection of the people or in the service of God. It isn't an act of hubris. It isn't, I can create a better creature than you can, or I can be godlike. It is always done for a purpose that is discussed and debated in the Talmud. Frankenstein is a human being. He's made out of human parts. He has a functioning brain. Frankenstein, the monster, the creature, the creature is a human being made up of human parts. Frankenstein went and got all the parts together and put together a human being and animated it. There's no question of whether it's human. There's a question of what kind of a human is this, and how does it fit into society, but it is considered human. While the Golem is not considered human beings. By the way, no Golem can speak, because in the rabbi's view, speech is a human quality, and speech comes from the soul. And so if you are not ensouled, you cannot speak. If you're not ensouled in a human way, you cannot speak, which is why animals cannot speak. because they don't contain a human soul. And if this creature could speak, we wouldn't be able to really tell the difference between it and a human being. So the rabbis consider the golem kind of somewhere between human and not human. And so, for example, they ask questions, if you had 9 men and a golem, can you daven? Right? Interesting question. Do you have to circumcise your golem? That assumes, of course, that the golem has certain parts that I've never seen depicted, but we'll let that go. And so they use the golem as a way to try to understand the nature of humanity, while Frankenstein is clearly human in the way in which it is considered in its construction. Frankenstein is made biologically. And this is really, for me, one of the key interesting parts of this. So he reanimates things that God already created, right? Frankenstein goes out and takes pieces of dead bodies and puts them together. So there's an old joke of this great scientist who says to God, I have now learned how to create a living human being from dust. Therefore, I am as great as you. And God said, really? Meet me out in the field and we'll see. So God and the man go out in the field, and the scientist is ready, and he puts his hands together, and God goes, you go first. He rubs his hand together, he goes down to reach dust, and God goes, no, 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 get your own dust. So, he doesn't create Frankenstein from scratch. He actually takes parts, takes a liver that already is a liver and a brain that's already a brain, and puts them together. Interestingly, the golem is made genetically, not biologically. And by that I mean it's made through letters, like the letters of DNA. It is animated by a code. Right? DNA is a code. It is a text in its own way. And it is thought about as a text. We represent it as a text. We describe it as a text. We talk about DNA as instructions. DNA are instructions to RNA on how to make proteins. So is the golem animated by a text. The text and the incantations, which is a spoken text, are the very things that create the golem, are the DNA that animates this creature. And so, in a metaphorical but profound way, there's a real difference in how we think about these two creations, and also what separates the Jewish view, the people of the book, the textual nature of how, the scriptural nature of how we think about almost everything, from a very Christian biological view of how you would animate a creature. Frankenstein is a freak. It's unnatural. What Frankenstein does, the creature is a freak. What Frankenstein does should never be done again, and is considered that way universally. While the golem is part of human beings' co-creation with God. It is part of the fact that in the Jewish tradition, we see the world as unfinished. We see the human form as unfinished, which is one of the interpretations of the reason for the Brit Milah. We circumcise to complete what was considered to be, that's our job on earth. God creates the male body at least and leaves it incomplete, and then the Brit Milah completes it. And this is an act of completing that which is unformed, trying to help perfect that which is imperfect. And so too is the creation of the golem, something like part of that act of co-creation in a way that Frankenstein is not. Even though I call him Frankenstein here, of course, as I told you, Frankenstein is not Frankenstein. He's the creature, he's the monster, he has no name. But in the movies, because I have Lon Chaney there, I'm calling him Frankenstein here, he has no name. And the fact that he is nameless, he himself comments on in the book, and it is part of Shelley's attempt to keep the creature as something other and different. Now, the question is, does the golem have a name? Yes, the golem has a name, believe it or not. In Rosenberg's book, Niflaot Maharal, the miracles of the Maharal. He names him the creature Joseph, or as the townspeople called him, Yussula Golem. Little Yussula. That looks like a Yussula, doesn't it? And the very fact that the golem has a name changes the nature of your relationship with the golem. Who can make Frankenstein? Anybody with technical knowledge can make Frankenstein. Mel Brooks' movie Young Frankenstein, when Gene Wilder finally discovers his grandfather's laboratory where he made Frankenstein, where he made the creature, he's walking around, he's looking, and there's a table. And on the table is a book. Does anybody remember what the name of the book is? How I Did It. Just sitting there on the table. It's called How I Did It. And the truth is that if you were technically able enough, you should be able to take Frankenstein's How I Did It book and create your own monster, right? All you need is the recipe. Well, the recipe for the golem exists, right? We have books that say how the rabbis did it. Not exactly, but pretty close. But the difference is, it doesn't matter. You could have the words, you could have the recipe, you could know exactly what the Maharal said or what Rava said, and you still couldn't do it, and I couldn't do it. No one in this room could do it. Because you must have the purity, the sanctity to be able to actually do it. And in fact, I said that some make goats and other creatures. There's sort of an evolutionary hierarchy here. The more righteous you are, the more advanced a creature you can make. And there are very, very few rabbis that can make a golem. Many more rabbis could make a goat. Right? So actually, your level of proficiency at creating and at animating a creature is in fact related to your righteousness. The entire book of Frankenstein is predicated on the problem that once Frankenstein creates his creature, he can't control him. There's nothing he can do. And the reason that he's up in the Arctic with a gun is he's trying to hunt down the creature and kill it. The creature that he created is stronger and faster. It's actually not the lumbering Frankenstein of the movies. It's a very agile, powerful creature that he created. It's very animal-like in its construction. It is not the way it's portrayed in the movies at all. But Frankenstein needs to hunt him down and kill him. And this is really an incredibly important key to the difference in the way in which Frankenstein teaches us a negative cautionary tale and the golem teaches us a positive model. And that is, the golem is always in control, the master is always in control of the golem, right? The golem goes out of control in the story of the Maharal, and the Maharal goes up and decommissions him. And as some of you may know, if you go to the synagogue in Prague that still exists today, they will not let you up into the attic where the pile of dirt that was the Maharal's golem supposedly still sits, where the Maharal destroyed it, covered with talaisim. And is that true or not? Don't know. But that's what you will be told if you're there, that the golem of Prague still lies as a pile of dirt in the shul there. Frankenstein abandons his creature, as we talked about, because of his hard appearance. And the monster takes revenge. Then Frankenstein tries to take revenge on the monster. So it is a cycle of destruction and revenge, while the creators of the golem take full responsibility for having created the golem. That is, there's no idea here, in the Jewish view, you create something, you must take responsibility for it. It is your creation. And when I talk to Jewish scientists, I always try to make this point. When I talk to scientists in general, I make this point too. I just don't use the golem and I don't use Jewish tradition. And that is, I just had this conversation at a big scientific meeting the other day. Scientists today do not have the luxury of being able to claim that they're simply creating things and putting them out there and have no responsibility for them anymore. And that becomes a very interesting conversation you have with scientists, especially with young scientists, graduate student scientists, and asking the question of how does one take responsibility for one's creations? How does one become an ethical scientist, a scientist who believes that you have a responsibility when you create something to follow it out into the public, to advocate for its proper use, and to advocate against its improper use. Scientists are often complain, and when I speak to them, I often hear them complain that they created something or they had some piece of scientific result that was misunderstood by the press, misused by the public. And I say to them, well, what did you do about it? Very often the answer is nothing. They just complain about it. And of course the answer is you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to be a spokesman to the public, and I think one of the big mistakes we've made with scientists over history is making it almost a negative that a scientist becomes a public spokesman for their science. They're seen as less of a serious scientist if they spend time talking to the press. And also the idea that knowledge is neutral, that a scientist's job is to create the knowledge, send it out, but that it's neutral and that the scientists themselves have no responsibility. And both the story of Frankenstein and the story of Golem are cautionary against that, from the two different sides of the question. Once the creature is created, there's no way to uncreate the creature, while with the Golem, of course, can be safely, there's an escape valve. And when I talk to scientists about some of our new biotechnologies, I say, what is the worst case scenario and what is the escape valve you have? How do you stop the development of what you think might be the worst possible use of this technology? And we do it all the time. We bring alien species in to try to solve a problem, and pretty soon the alien species is the problem. Or we create a technology. Every piece of technology that we create to solve, we create technologies usually to solve a problem, often to solve a problem of older technology. And yet the new technology, no matter how good it is, always creates new problems. And then we create newer technologies to try to solve the problems of those technologies. And that's why technology exponentially increases, but it's also why we always seem to have too much technology and not enough technology at the same time. The message of Shelley is about responsibility, it's about aesthetics, it's about humility, it's about hypocrisy, and the goals and limits of science, and it's very much about what it means to be human. Shelley was very interested in talking about the question of how we think about what a human being is and how the creature is part of that conversation. The message of some Golem tales is about piety, service, but also what it means to be human. That's why the Golem is actually created, as an attempt to try to discuss what it means to be a human being and what parts of the Golem are different than that. So, those are some examples of just putting the Golem and Frankenstein side by side and trying to ask ourselves the question of what the difference is between these two tales. But ultimately, they are saying somewhat of the same thing. One from a cautionary side, one from a modeling side. And that is, if we are actually going to engage in the enterprise of creating new forms of life, and we are doing that now in ways that are astounding. Okay? So to give you some examples, we've created brand new hybrid animals. Right? We now have ligers, which are lion-tiger hybrids, the largest cats in the world. We have camas, which are camel-llama hybrids. We have geeps, which are sheep-goat hybrids. The first geep that was made was then slaughtered and eaten. They wanted to be the first ones to eat a transgenic animal like that. I think they said it tastes like chicken. I'm not sure. So we have those things. Then we've also created transgenic animals. Those are hybridized. We also have transgenic animals. So now we have animals where we take genes from some other creature. We put it into those animals, or we manipulate their genes to meet certain kinds of ends. So, for example, we have We've taken green fluorescent protein, which is often used in scientific studies, and we've created almost every mammal except for higher apes and human beings that glows green. We have monkeys that glow green. We have rabbits that glow green. We have cats and dogs, and we don't have cats yet. We have dogs. No, we have cats. We have kittens that glow green. We have created transgenic animals in other ways. We have goats, for example, where we want to create a certain drug, and we genetically alter the animal so that that drug, the molecule, is expressed in its milk or in its blood, which means that we have a few, and pretty soon we'll probably have many, many more flocks of animals who live simply to create drugs for us. Some of those drugs have been now approved for the market. It took a long time. We have transgenic salmon. They just created the salmon. They took a gene from a pike and another type of salmon, and they put it into a salmon so that this salmon grows 2/3 larger than your regular salmon, and they've been trying for now over a decade to get it approved for eating in the United States. I could go on and on and on. We've grafted a human ear, not an actual human ear, but the shape of human ear on the back of a mouse in order to show that you could grow, and then made the mouse immunosuppressed for human transplantation. So they genetically alter the mouse so that its skin is less reactive with human beings. They take a polymer scaffolding in the shape of an ear, and they put it on the back of the mouse. If you want to, I don't know, if you want to see pictures of all these things I'm talking about, I have a TED Talk. So if you go to TED.com, TEDtalk.com, TED.com, and you just put my name in the search engine, you can see pictures of all these things I'm talking about. We are creating new forms of life. We've barely touched human beings yet. But I don't know how many of you heard, but the first actual human clone, embryonic clone, that is, the first human cloned embryos, have now been created. The fact that we can now clone, there was a claim once before by a South Korean, Dr. Wang, that he had done that, but he hadn't. The fact that we can now clone human embryos means that we can do almost anything to them. That is, we could theoretically right now make a human being that glows green. Right? Easier to find your kids at night, but I'm not sure any of us wants that experiment to go on. As we begin to move into these incredibly sophisticated technological feats, as we begin to create new creatures, new plants, new animals, and maybe at some point different kinds of human beings or human beings that are genetically altered in one way or another, certainly at the beginning in good ways, maybe to cure disease, but once you can genetically engineer a gene to change disease, you can genetically engineer a gene to do anything. We have to start asking ourselves very seriously what we should do and not just what we can do. And I think that both of these stories are ways for us to think about this more deeply than we have so far. So thank you for your attention. We have what, about 15 more minutes before, what time does this end? Yeah, so let's have a conversation now, take some questions, and
This is, if I recall the novel correctly, Shelley's creature was actually a good-hearted creature that was only became evil because he was rejected by society, and it goes along with the romantic view that people are born good and are corrupted by society. There's only because I think, isn't there a blind man that he becomes very friendly with?
Yeah, but
because blind man can't see him, so
right.
Blind man.
He's a little more complicated. You're right. When he's first created, he's good, and when he goes into this hut and begins to be able to talk and reflect, he's good. But remember, everything we know about the creature is from the creature's own mouth. The creature tells the story of the creature. Frankenstein knows nothing about him but his evil, right? He abandons him, and the next thing he knows, the creature is killing people that he cares about. Then the creature goes on to tell his own story. And his story, he portrays himself as the wronged party, as this good-hearted person. When does he become bad? He finds Frankenstein's diary. He goes back to where he was created. He finds the diary, and he reads what Frankenstein actually did and what Frankenstein thought of him. And that's when he realized that he was abandoned because he was ugly and that Frankenstein was ashamed of him, and that's when he turns into this bad creature. Is that romantic vision of the, you know, of the soul corrupted by society what Shelley was trying to say? Lots of interpreters think so. But some other interpreters have pointed out that everybody tells stories in that book that paints themselves in the best possible light, except Frankenstein. Frankenstein is pretty brutal on himself for a while because he says that because at the beginning he spouts some very noble sounding things which he ends up violating. So Frankenstein's a hypocrite, but the creature tells his own story.
As I recall, the creature feels guilt because of guilt feelings, whatever, commits suicide at the end.
He talks about committing suicide, but it isn't just about guilt. The creature, we don't know what happens to the creature. The creature runs off, right? The creature runs off after he sees Frankenstein die. He sees Frankenstein die in the cabin of the captain, and he runs off. And he says, you know, I don't know what I'll do. Maybe I'll kill myself. I mean, she intentionally leaves it ambiguous what happens to the creature. Yeah?
Golem Jewish.
Is Golem Jewish? That's a great question. I don't see anywhere where it says Golem is or is not Jewish. Golem, by the way, interestingly, is sometimes portrayed with a kippah and sometimes not. There are some portrayals of Golem with a talis on, which is a but these aren't portrayals from the Talmud. These are modern interpretations. But how could the Golem be Jewish if the Golem is not? I mean, what defines what makes someone Jewish is birth from a Jewish female, right? So in that sense, Golem couldn't be Jewish. But it's never discussed. I don't think the rabbis are particularly interested in whether the Golem's Jewish. If they ask the reason that the Golem cannot make the 10th person in a minyan is not, according to the discussion, because he's not Jewish. Because he's not human. So it's interesting that that's not brought up. Again, the Golem is used as a theoretical, as a mind experiment, as a mind problem to try to think through things. So I never actually read or heard about a conversation or speculation about whether the Golem was Jewish or not, just about whether the Golem was human or not. Interesting, yeah.
Do you have the Talmudic reference
for which thing?
For rather the original?
Yeah, I can give it to you. I'll give it to you afterwards. Okay. Yeah. Well, it was it doesn't say what it was used for by Rava. Rava creates it, sends it to Zera. Zera kills it and says, and there are different interpretations about why Zera kills it. It doesn't say. It says you're one of the pietists and I'm going to kill you. Some say it was because he thought that Rava was engaged in hubris. Rava was trying to actually create a human being and created this sort of pseudo-human being, and that was not worth living. Others say because the Golem engaged in, not blasphemy, because that's verbal, but another kind of wrong behavior, immoral behavior. Nobody really knows. That's the entire passage. Yeah, I mean, was this on that or something else? Okay, 1 second. It doesn't say why he was created. He was just created. Rava created a human being, sent him to Zera. That's all it says. No, not the Rava story. He was in the Maharal. When Rabbi Yehuda of Lo created him, which was many centuries later, he was used to protect Prague from pogroms, from the people from pogroms. So we think of the Golem as created as a protector because the Maharal story is the most famous story of the Golem. But not all Golems were created for that purpose. Yeah?
Is a golem animal considered an animal or a thing?
Considered an animal or what?
Or a thing.
Or a thing? That's exactly what they argue about. And different rabbis have different opinions. And some rabbis say you can slaughter a golem goat however you want and eat it because it's not really a goat because it isn't born of goat. Which, by the way, was used in a very interesting conversation that Jewish science fiction fans had about whether you could have a ham and cheese sandwich from a replicator on the Starship Enterprise. Okay? So on the Starship Enterprise, you go up to the thing and you say, let me have a cheese sandwich, and it makes a cheese sandwich. And you say, let me have a steak, and it makes a steak. And it does it by taking molecules and putting them together into the thing you want. So could you have ham? Could you have a cheeseburger? And they argued it. And very interesting to read those arguments, because the arguments in the 1990s and 2000s online about whether you can eat a cheeseburger replicated from Starship Enterprise is just the exact modern thought experiment of whether you can eat the goat that is made as a golem. It's exactly the same thing. It is trying to understand the nature of what, in that case, you're trying to understand what exactly is the prohibition here. Is the prohibition have to do something with an unclean animal? Well, then this isn't really an animal. I mean, if you actually just create the ham steak, you never had a pig in the first place, if a ham thing is called a steak. I don't know, from ham. But, right? So you've never actually even had a pig. You sort of bypassed pigness and went right to the ham, right? Which, by the way, just as long as we're on this fascinating topic, they are now talking about the ability to take cells and to create meat from them, pure meat, bypassing the animal. So that becomes an interesting question. Now, if you start with a pig cell and you create a pork chop, you still have the argument that you're starting with a pig cell. So maybe, that's not kosher because you started with, even though it's a microscopic piece of pig, you're starting with a piece of pig. But what if we could bypass that? What if we could, start, I mean, this isn't even close to being possible. But what if you could actually manipulate another cell? Or what if you could take DNA from a pig and put it into a cow cell? We can do that in other ways. These are questions that the rabbis are actually beginning to deal with. Some technology brings up interesting questions about what is halachically acceptable and what isn't. Yeah.
You've posited a lot of differences that you attributable to a Jewish tradition and a Christian tradition. How many of these differences do you think though may be caused more by the historical?
Right. So I actually don't think it's so much Jewish and Christian necessarily. I think it is more about, it certainly is Jewish and Christian in their attitude of the church versus Judaism towards science and technology, right? Judaism is much more science positive than Christianity has been. I mean, now there's so many different many of the modern forms of Christianity are very pro-science, but if you think about the Catholic Church and its history, it was very wary of science. Not only in things like Galileo, but they didn't allow autopsies. I mean, they didn't allow people to autopsy bodies even for any reason at all. They were very wary of certain kinds of medical advancements because they thought that Judaism is all the way on the other side of that issue most of the time. And I think the golem is an illustration of that. The fact that creating an inanimate creature is not considered an affront to God, which I think is a very Christian idea. I mean, it's not just Frankenstein. I think it is the reflection of the golem in the Christian mind. But I also agree that it was the whole book is a very romantic book in its own way, it absolutely reflects its time. What I find so fascinating about it, and why I encourage people to read it, is because it's a beautiful contemplation of the role of science in life and of the kind of attitude you should bring to scientific work in ways that people don't understand that is what Shelley was really concerned about. She wasn't concerned about monsters, and she wasn't concerned about some dramatic tale of chasing the monster down. She was concerned about Frankenstein's thought process and why he did what he did and what was wrong with his thought process. And it's just as relevant for scientists today as it was then. Yeah?
What's the current legislation on human cloning, if there is any?
There's none.
And is there any conversation about it?
The only thing that there is insofar as there's legislation about cloning, it is about the use of embryos in general. There is a general agreement internationally not to allow human reproductive cloning. That is, not to allow a cloned human embryo to be gestated to a full living human being. However, there are plenty of places where you could take a cloned human embryo and use it for research. Places now that allow embryo research, there's no reason, in fact, forget about the human side of it for a second. If you want to understand a disease, and in a goat, since we're talking a lot about goats today, let's just stick with goats. You want to understand a disease in a goat, and you have a goat embryo that is going to develop that disease genetically. What you want to do is clone a lot of them, of that embryo, because it's hard to go out and find more embryos with that disease. You want to clone a lot of them so you have plenty of them to experiment on. The same thing would be true with human embryos. If you had a human embryo that was a carrier of Tay-Sachs disease, forget the morality of it a second, I'm talking purely instrumentally, what you would want to do is clone as many of those embryos as possible to, if you were going to do research on how to try to fix that in an embryo. So you would want, and that's called therapeutic cloning, so you would want to do human therapeutic cloning for that purpose. And right now there are some places that allow it and some places that don't allow it, but what you certainly can't do is do human reproductive cloning. There's no place that allows that. The problem is that you don't need permission. I mean, someone had already claimed to do that, again, falsely once before, claimed they had a pregnant woman with a cloned embryo in her, and the press bought it, and they had a field day until scientists said to the press, wait a second, we can't clone a human embryo yet. I don't care if he said he did it, he didn't. They kept asking him to produce this woman, and he got his 15 minutes of fame by claiming that she was in hiding because she was scared they were going to kill her. I don't know who was going to kill her. Somebody was going to kill her. So anyway, and then that died out when it was clear that he was bluffing. But, you know, somebody somewhere can create a human embryo in the lab and implant it, and the fact that the country doesn't allow it, then what are they going to do?
Who's funding it?
Nobody.
But is there no one, so it's not happening?
Well, nobody's funding human reproductive cloning, but cloning human embryos is just part of the whole process of trying to understand embryo dynamics. So.
So is the funding of that coming from government or is it private?
Yes, it's coming from everywhere. It's coming from government, it's coming from private industry. There's a lot of research going on by both. And it's very different in different countries, what's allowed and what's not allowed. Yeah.
So I find it interesting that the Golem itself has a binary on-off switch and histogram. Is that the first human-computer interaction?
That's an interesting question. That's a really interesting question. It certainly is using a very small piece of software, 3 letters, you know, in the software. But you could, I guess you could make that claim, couldn't you?
And is the righteousness required to build one? Could that be subjective?
Well, it certainly could be subjective. It's not seen as subjective, fully subjective. I mean, in the Talmud, of course, to be righteous, you have to be a learned, pious rabbi, at least. So, you know, they know what they mean by pious. Yeah.
I wanted to see if you thought about the links maybe between Frankenstein and the monster and Dr. Faustus and his sort of excessive interest in science. They both delve too deeply into the secrets of the world. They're both cleverer than all their peers.
Right.
And in Faustus, you have, I suppose, we asked Mephistopheles' pet devil to create a Socrates in the face of a female she-devil in the face of Helena of Troy.
Right.
Maybe, I don't know, I'm wondering if you can make some link in terms of generation. And that's probably a point where Faustus damns himself irrevocably.
Right.
Is when he kind of meets with the she-devil.
Right.
So that final act rather than all the...
Yeah, but I mean, clearly it's a cautionary tale in the same way, right? It's a cautionary tale in the same way Frankenstein is. It is generally negative about technology and the overuse of technology, and both of them are about hubris in some way, right? So that's the interesting thing here, is that there's a real polarity between and Faustus is a Christian in the broad sense story. And what you see on the Christian side more often, or on the Western secular side more often, are the cautionary tales. And what you see on the Jewish side are the modeling tales, right? And that's what I think is so fascinating about this whole thing, is you don't see many Jewish cautionary tales about you know, the dangers of technology insofar as, you know, whatever that technology is. You see some of them. You don't see a lot of them, and you don't see a lot of Jewish caution about hubris. you see a lot of Jewish exhortation to be pious and humble, but you don't see a lot of negative examples in the Jewish stories of people with great arrogance and hubris who go awry. You see a lot of stories about why it's good to be pious and humble. Yeah.
Maybe it's to do with Christian ideas of original sin. So pride is the evil counterpoint of justice,
Right.
and the sense that there's something bad within humans inherently, which is
Right.
waiting to get out, waiting to...
And you know, perfect example of that in the Jewish thought is Yetzer HaTov, Yetzer Hara. And what's so interesting about Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, is even that is considered a good thing to have in Judaism, right? Without the Yetzer Hara, no house would ever be built, we're taught. That is, the evil inclination isn't really evil, it is that which could lead us to evil if it isn't controlled correctly. If you don't employ and tame your Yetzer Hara correctly, it can go off and harm you and harm others. But when properly controlled, you need to have it, right? You can't exist without it. What time are we looking at? Are we pretty much done? Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming and paying attention. Feel free, if you have any more thoughts about this, I'm really obviously fascinated with this topic, please feel free to email me. You can find me online at Emory University Center for Ethics. Thanks.